Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to the class, both to new and long-time students and lovers of history. This is History with Sire here today to discuss with you our final topic for the study on the French Wars, which is the very famous Battle of Waterloo. We've done lots in this series now. We've looked at the naval warfare with Horatio Nelson. We looked at key battles there, especially the Battle of Trafalgar. We moved on to the Peninsular War with Arthur Wellesley's actions and the likes of Torres Vedras, Salamanca, and at Vittoria, and now we've made it here to the Battle of Waterloo, the most famous battle perhaps of the entire French era between Arthur Wellesley and Napoleon Bonaparte. If you haven't already, do make sure you've gone back and checked out all those videos in the series because they will provide that brilliant foundation to help you understand the British experience of warfare as we get into this battle here at Waterloo. With that said, notepads and pens at the ready, and let us begin. So in this final series, we're looking at the Battle of Waterloo. But like before, we're going to split it up into key parts. We're going to look at the situation up until 1815, what's happened after Wellesley's victory at Vittoria in 1813. We're going to see what's happened throughout 1814. We're then going to look at what happens with Napoleon and his troops in early 1815, the preliminary engagements that of course lead up to the actual Battle of Waterloo in the Hundred Days campaign, and then into the actual battle itself with Waterloo, which will also include an assessment how the Anglo-Allied forces were able to beat Napoleon here in the final major battle of the Coalition Wars. So that said, let us get straight into it. So the first one we have to do is, of course, summarise the situation by 1815. Now, a lot has happened since Wellington's victory at Vittoria way back in 1813. Perhaps the most major thing that's happened is the French Empire has really begun to collapse. We mentioned how Napoleon has suffered a massive setback against the Russians with his retreat from Moscow in the winter of 1812, and this has only gotten worse. He has, of course, a two-front problem that really escalated. The British, Portuguese, and Spanish have managed to drive their way through all of Spain and effectively kick the French out of the peninsula entirely. The Russians, allied with the Austrians and Prussians, have advanced on the eastern front and taken all the European land back. A decisive engagement happened at the Battle of Leipzig. It was here that the three emperors rallied together and managed to defeat Napoleon's forces and overwhelm him. Napoleon had no choice but to retreat. After several more engagements, the French were eventually overrun. Wellington himself even launched an invasion into southern France and really applied the pressure onto Napoleon. We have to remember Wellington really has become a famous figure in this entire history. He, of course, has actually defeated personally 6 of Napoleon's marshals, and in doing so, has proved himself a fine commander, not just for the British, but also for the coalition forces as a whole. Napoleon, meanwhile, has finally suffered some major defeats, and so by April 1814, he is forced to abdicate his position as Emperor of France, and in effect, France has to surrender. They finally give up after all these years of various coalition conflicts that have been indecisive or inconclusive. We finally have a decisive victory with the coalition forces, and that is Britain, Spain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia have finally managed to come together, encircled France, and finally defeated them. Napoleon now has had to abdicate, and he has found himself exiled to Elba Island. Meanwhile, for Wellesley, he's been rewarded for all of his successes. In fact, many people are now starting to consider him perhaps the greatest military commander of this era, given all of his success in the Peninsular War. Napoleon himself personally dismissed this. He still saw himself as his superior commander and blamed others for the failings since his retreat from Moscow in 1812. Wellesley, of course, gets the reward, and he is made the Duke of Wellington for his efforts. He is also made the ambassador for France as the coalition forces work to rebuild France into the monarchy it once was before the revolutions in the 1790s. And through that, the French monarchy is restored, and Louis XVIII is put on the throne to rule instead. However, despite these actions, life in France still did not improve, and many French citizens actually miss Napoleon and the Emperor and the Republic that had been created. The monarch as well, much like Louis XVI before him, was not well liked and seen as hoarding the wealth at the top once again. It also wasn't helped that the 4 coalition allies were not getting along. They met at something called the Congress of Vienna as they began to agree and try to figure out how they would rebuild Europe. But they came to many conflicts with one another, and not much was really resolved in the several months that they had this Congress ongoing. So by 1815, Napoleon, hearing what was going on, hearing how France was still struggling, decided that he would resist, he would end his time in exile, and he would take the 1,000-man force that he had been gifted to leave the island and to go back to France and become emperor once more. And so by March 1815, Napoleon had returned to France. Now, initially, the coalition forces were not too concerned. They thought that given all the changes they had made, the French people would not rally back to the emperor. Again, the army had been reassigned loyalty to the monarchy, and actually, many of Napoleon's marshals had been sworn oaths to protect the monarchy. Perhaps most notable of them was Marshal Ney, a cavalry commander. However, upon Napoleon coming back, this very quickly changed. In fact, there's many famous tales of Napoleon approaching various barracks and army divisions that were sent out to capture him, holding himself up, saying, "If you dare to shoot your emperor, then feel free to do so." But many would not. Again, the charisma, the aura that was around Napoleon maintained, and instead of shooting or capturing Napoleon, they would throw down their rifles and re-swear their loyalty to him. This was also the same when Marshal Ney's own division was sent out, and he himself threw his sword down at Napoleon's feet and declared the emperor has come home. Upon this happening, the French monarchy fled. Louis XVIII left the country, and the coalition forces knew they would have to go to war once again to stop Napoleon. And so Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia reformed their coalition once again, and this was the War of the Seventh Coalition. However, it's also a very short war in the various coalition wars that have happened. It will only be about 100 days long, and there's only a few major engagements that happen. But all the same, we have to study them and understand what happened. Now, initially on the surface, this will seem quite a simple affair. The coalition forces vastly outnumber the French. They have more soldiers, more artillery, more cavalry, and Napoleon is a spent man. He's tiring by this point. He's getting older. In fact, there's many reports that actually he's struggling with his health. I think he actually is suffering with disease and exhaustion from all of his campaign and traveling. However, Napoleon feels a sense of confidence. Britain's forces, for instance, are predominantly away in America. Some of you may be aware of a conflict known as the War of 1812. Americas has resisted British rule, and so because of that, they actually are lacking a lot of their forces in the country at this time. Also, the mobilization of Austrian and Russian forces will take time. They're still quite far away from where France actually is. The nearest ones, then, are the Prussian forces and an Anglo-Allied front towards Belgium, which is made up of the British, Belgians, Dutch, and Germans. The Prussian army is located out in the east, and they're led by Field Marshal Blucher. Napoleon, therefore, has a very simple plan, and that will involve striking first in modern-day Belgium. So what exactly is Napoleon's plan? Well, Napoleon, he perfectly understood the coalition would outnumber him. He had roughly 120,000 strong army, about 89,000 infantry, 22,000 cavalry, and 11,000 artillerymen with about 360 guns at their disposal. Meanwhile, the Prussian and Anglo-Allied army alone had some 250,000 strong army ready to use. And then, of course, you have the Austrians and Russians who are mobilizing. This force can very quickly double in size by July of 1815. So Napoleon knew he had to act first while the coalition was getting ready, preparing their forces and transferring the armies to the right positions. He believed he could attack and hope for a quick victory using something called defeat in detail. A very common way to say this is famously divide and conquer. Napoleon had had many string of successes using defeat in detail. The concept was simple. You had a smaller force yourself. For simple numbers, let's say you have a force of 100 soldiers, but you're going to face a force of 150 soldiers. So what you would do is you would strike in the center of position and split them up. So that 150 strong force would suddenly become 75 on one side and 75 on the other. You would then take your entire 100 strong force and attack one half of the 75. You would then overwhelm them because in battle he who has more people has a massive advantage and numerical stronger force, and then that force would be defeated. Then you could turn your 100 men onto the remaining 75, and the same thing, you have more men, more guns, and therefore you overwhelm them. And that's the basic concept of defeat in detail. And so Napoleon planned to do this against the Prussians and Anglo-Allied forces situated in Belgium. So Napoleon's idea was a simple one. He wanted to smash the hinge between the Anglo-Allied and Prussian armies, leaving himself free to maneuver against whichever he believed was weaker and therefore make the space in order to finish the other one off later. He would therefore use his numerically superior over each force, so long as he would not have to split across both fronts simultaneously. Again, remember, a big reason he lost the war previously was because he was split on two fronts. He had one force fighting in Eastern Europe, and he had his other force all the way in the peninsula. So two front wars are far from ideal. His success in using this strategy relied on the central position to get his army into a roughly 10-mile square box between the Anglo-Allied and Prussian armies before they could fully appreciate the situation and prepare their own attack. From evidence, it appears Napoleon planned to attack Blucher and the Prussians first. Napoleon would later say after the conflict that he saw Blucher as having a hussar complex, believing that he actually was more aggressive and more bold in his actions, whereas Wellington, as we famously covered, had a more cautious nature, a very learned preference for defence that he had used in the Peninsular War, and therefore would naturally want to retreat his positions rather than engaging in brawls. Therefore, it's quite telling to see that Blucher, rather than retreating entirely, would probably be likely to fall back and reappoint his soldiers to attack again in a later date, whereas Wellington would happily keep seceding space so long as it meant his army could survive and maintain a defensive front. Again, just think back to our Lines of Torres Vedras video, where Wellington is constantly falling back over those 30 miles of entrenchments to overwhelm the French and make them stretch themselves out through defense in depth. Therefore, Napoleon really wanted to test the alliance. He wanted to see if Blucher really would stay strong to Wellington or if it would break down, and therefore he actually would retreat rather than help Wellington out when he would face attack. And this brings us to Quatre Bras and Ligny, the first major engagements of this Waterloo campaign. As expected, Napoleon went on the front foot first, and he engaged the Prussian forces who were at Ligny. This was quite a decisive, aggressive action from Napoleon. Again, this is a man who has been known for being opportunistic and very attack-minded. He had lost about 10 battles in all his time as a commander, and he'd won over 50 by this point in his entire career, and a lot of them had come from aggression. And it was through his attack at Ligny that he did indeed overwhelm the Prussians. They were heavily hit, and Blucher's forces were forced to make a strategic retreat. They truly were overwhelmed, and Napoleon had a decisive victory. Wellington, meanwhile, defended quite strongly at the fields of Quatre Bras. Napoleon had split off his marshals and allowed Marshal Ney to lead a strong force to attack Wellington's position. Wellington knew that this extreme right flank for Blucher's forces was not very tenable and decided to withdraw northwestwards towards the slope of Mont Saint Jean. Wellington very smartly understood that given Napoleon's unpredictable nature, again, this is the man who could improvise, and so because of that, saw that Cornwall was indeed a good stance to take rather than a bad one. And therefore, having this extreme caution in the presence of such a very unpredictable commander was, in every way, probably common sense. Indeed, Wellington was expecting a sort of imaginative approach in Ney's attack here. Instead, it became a very scrappy, brawlish sort of battle and was quite drawish. And therefore, Wellington decided to withdraw from the battle on June 16, 1815, having understood the Prussians were not going to help him on his position because they too had been overwhelmed by Napoleon's attack. And so instead, Wellington moved to retreat to the farm of Waterloo, where he believed he'd fight Napoleon from a better defensive position. Napoleon understood this. He had to act fast. He had two choices now, Napoleon. He could either chase Blucher's forces and try and overwhelm the Prussians, or instead go after Wellington's forces and meet him at Waterloo. So what Napoleon chose to do was to go after Wellington, but he understood the Prussians may indeed come back and try and meet with Wellington's forces and do a joint attack. If this happened, Napoleon knew his chances of victory would become ever slim. Because as we said, he did not have as many forces as the Prussians and Anglo-Allied armies did together. So he chose one of his other marshals, Grouchy, to take 30,000 men and chase Blucher and the Prussians to delay their arrival to Waterloo and make sure they couldn't attack. Wellington, meanwhile, who again famously was a master of terrain and master of defence, decided to dig in at Waterloo and make use of the hills and landmass there to give himself a terrain advantage. Again, a principle of warfare that was always on Wellington's side was to defend because defending was always going to be easier than attacking into a position. This meant Napoleon had to do the tougher thing, had to advance and attack at Waterloo. Wellington famously said that, of course, he had concentrated his army on Quatre Bras, but he knew he had to stop Napoleon here at Waterloo and make the fight of it there. Napoleon moved quickly. He wanted to attack and make this decisive pitched battle of the engagement before Blucher had any chance to move around and link up with Wellington's forces. And that is where we're going to leave this video now on the preliminary part of the Battle of Waterloo. I hope you found this video quite engaging, quite useful. I hope you're taking some good notes and, of course, understanding this conflict as we go into detail. Again, this is our final coalition war that we're looking at, so it's very important now we understand the British experience of war and exactly how Wellington is going to fight and win this battle going forward. Do make sure, as always, you're like, commenting, and subscribing throughout these videos. Your engagement, as always, is much appreciated. And thank you to those who are engaging by liking, subscribing, and commenting in videos already. Forward to seeing you on our following video, where we'll get into the actual Battle of Waterloo, and famously, Napoleon and Wellington's only official battle they had again directly against one another during the entirety of the coalition wars. With all that said, this has been History with Sire. Thank you for listening.